Tender Strands by Martin Dempsey. Chapter 21. Primitive. Mr. Cavil? The voice was deep, male and authoritative. Cavil looked up. He was at the back of the shop floor, rummaging around in and tidying the first aid station. It was late, and Cavil had worked the night shift. It had been several days since Judy's death, and he was finding it hard to go near the pit's lift. Apart from Cavil, the two visitors, and them, the building was currently empty. The four drivers who were working that night were all out. The two strangers who had entered the shop must have taken care to open the door slowly and quietly, avoiding the automatic courtesy alarm which was rigged to sound. The man who addressed him was of average height, with widely spaced liquid eyes, a slight hunch, and wore a beige raincoat over an office shirt and loud suit pants. The woman behind him wore a black and grey pinstripe dress and black heels. For a moment, Cavil had to register the man was holding a badge up. I'm Smith. This is my associate, Clark. Please, may I trouble you for some of your time? It's in regard to a number of deaths that have occurred, individuals which we have reason to believe may have had dealings with your cab company. I would very much like to ask you some questions. Oh, of course. We can talk in my office. It's in the back. Cavil stood up. Remember the first aid box? Stooped, closed it, and put it back on the wall, and then turned. If you'd like to follow me, my associate will stay in the main building, if that's okay. Smith turned and made eye contact with Clark, and she nodded a short nod. Of course. Would either of you like a drink of some kind? There's coffee near the entrance desk and a hot water canteen. For the drivers and customers, but you're welcome to help yourself. Cavil's voice trailed off. Damn. Now he couldn't remember if he'd been stewing loud tea before. He got at it in the head to check the fire extinguishers were still sound, and if the first aid boxes needed topping up. He daren't rush over to check. Lao wasn't exactly illegal, but it wasn't exactly legal either, and the last thing he needed was a night in the cell with a duty officer thought it over. Thank you. Yes, I will. The lady smiled at him. She turned her head around until she located the drink station and headed over to it. Cavil fought back the urge to request she only have coffee and ignore the teapot. The back room? Smith said pointedly. Yes, this way. Cavil forced himself to walk towards the office without checking to see what the woman was up to. She'd have coffee, he reassured himself. All cops like coffee. As he got to the door of his office, a second wave of concern washed over him. It wasn't unusual for one or more of them to be in his office, especially at night, especially if he'd been imbibing. They seemed to like the smell and the taste, and he expected they'd like the vibe he gave off while high on Lao and or Tanis. In a stroke of what he felt was subtle and low-level genius, Cavil let his hand slip off the door handle without turning it fully. His foot kicked the panel of the door. Oh, sorry. Cavil half turned to Smith and added through the forced smile in a too loud and forced voice. You'd think I'd have something to hide. Smith simultaneously noticed a slight pause before the word hide and the overemphasis and increased volume of the word, and at the same time couldn't quite believe that somebody would be so blatantly ineffectual and transparent. Several clues then clicked together for Smith. The trembling hands, the wide pupils, overworking facial muscles. This man was on something. Cavil slowly, too slowly, opened the door to his office and darted his head around, checking the floor, walls and ceiling. Smith coolly appraised the back of Cavil's hair bun as it swiveled left, right and up and down, darted forward and tucked back. Smith settled on the conclusion that Cavil was currently high and quite possibly tripping. Cavil exhaled. His shoulders dropped, and he swung the door wide open and stepped inside. Smith followed him. The room was larger than the small amount of furniture required. A rather large wooden desk, an extremely well-stuffed and very comfy-looking office chair, 2 filing cabinets and a large white board took up the centre of the room. In one side of the room, an area was devoted to a bamboo yoga mat with foam blocks, bands and cushions. The opposite side, a large beanbag, and a small table with a collection of pipes, lighters, rolling paper, all under a large dream catcher. Cavil crossed the room and sat down in the office chair, sinking into it and leaning back slightly, supported by the chair's sprung tilt back. Smith stood, waiting, refusing to be awkward. Realization dawned on Cavil's face and he sprung to his feet. Oh, I can grab a chair from the entrance. No, that's fine. You sit down. I'm happy standing. Smith paused with the aim of letting Cavill realize that this was the intentional power move, and Cavill unwittingly gifted Smith the authoritative position in the conversation, hopefully dispelling any psychological benefit of being on his own ground and being seated behind a large desk that might have granted. Cavill nodded and sank back down. I'd like to ask you about the arrangements your drivers have with your business. Firstly, if I may. Yes, of course. Calvill's face composed itself into a look of frowning concern, and he sat forward, hands rubbing the tops of his thighs. They're all contractors? They are. Basically, they hire the cabs from me. I ensure the upkeep of the cabs and keep them in paying gas, cover the insurance, and all that. They sign a contract accepting a level of reliability for any accidents, and are expected to return the cabs at the end of each shift in good order, keep them clean, that sort of thing. But if they need something, I sometimes carry them over by letting them off the rent for a week or so. Do they pay back in arrears? Usually. Sometimes I weigh hours, so if they owe, say, 14 hours, if they do 7 hours overnight, I'll count them as a double. Smith frowned. How does that help you? They're contractors? Cavill nodded. It doesn't help me, but it keeps the cab company relatively reliable, a go-to, which helps the other drivers keep a steady stream of work. Smith tried to examine the arrangement from different angles in his head, trying to see if there could be a hidden motive in it for Cavill, but he couldn't find one. He next asked the question of a genuine personal interest. Never been stiffed? Cavill's face formed a small smile. All the time. Basically every third or fourth driver and almost every single ex-driver. Smith nodded. Despite himself, he found himself liking the man. Do you keep a close eye on how far they're driving and where? Yes, via GPS. Do you keep those records for a while? Usually for at least a month. This is more for insurance purposes than anything else, and to make sure that someone isn't just driving off with a cab or in case of accidents, emergencies, and that. Once or twice, it's helped with people getting out of speeding accusations or accusations of deliberately overcharging someone by taking a long route. Before you ask, I'm not okay with just handing over my data or letting you walk off with one of my computers or any of my hard drives, and I'm not okay with you giving you a printout of the records or anything like that. Smith looked up sharply. Oh? Why not? I don't need to answer that question. I will say that if you present me with a court order, naturally I'll comply, and if you give me specific dates or a specific location, I'll be willing to check, and if I deem it in the public interest, I'll hand that information over. But I won't expose any of my drivers' personal information to you. For the duration of their renting my taxi cabs, they're their own people. If they want to drive around for fun, visit their grandmothers, take a cruise along the beach, they're perfectly entitled to do that, and I won't risk exposing their private information about their whereabouts to authorities unless I deem it for the public good, or if I have to. Smith let a silence develop. Cavill proved to have been more assertive than he'd expected, and this was a nightmare scenario for the dodgy driver hypothesis, and it was an outcome Clark and Smith had already discussed through the entire encounter. Two authoritative officers turn up late at night, cornering him when they knew he was alone, one lurking in the background, the Stasi-esque approach. This was exactly what he was intended to avoid. If Cavill was being truthful, and his drivers only rented the cabs, it also proved bad news for the Cavill the cartel kingpin hypothesis. It would be far harder to use the garage as a money laundering front, and his drivers far less likely to be acting as dealers or delivery men, given they were effectively paying to be in on any potential scam. The direct challenge to the authority Smith represented, however, couldn't go without pushback. If you're confident that you and your drivers have nothing to hide, Mr. Cavill, you shouldn't have any qualms about allowing law enforcement to look over your records. In the worst case scenario, and if one of your drivers or someone they know is somehow involved in the instances we're investigating, it's imperative that we find out as soon as possible, not just for the safety of the general public, but for your other drivers and even yourself. Smith didn't hold much hope for the implied threat to Cavill's well-being. The Smith felt that the suggestion that his drivers would be at risk might hit home, and that would be a catastrophe, which is why I'm willing to help on my terms and in my way until I'm compelled to cede my autonomy to a court of law. Smith noticed that Cavill spoke like an educated man. His words didn't come across as an affectation, nor did it match the pattern of sovereign citizen or libertarian rhetoric. Cowell seemed familiar with the technicalities of legal obligations, and once again Smith pondered if he might have more experience in, or at least prepared himself for, dealing with the authorities. I see. I'll need to look into a 10-year court order, but in theory I can see a world in which we would be prepared to provide you with a list of names, dates, and locations of instances we fear may be linked in some way with customers of your taxi cabs. If you'd be willing to accept responsibility of not sharing that information with anyone at all, under pain of potential arrest for jeopardizing an investigation. If any of that information were mishandled, would that be a way in which you'd feel like you could assist us? There was a pause. Smith looked up from his notepad again. Cowell's eyes were wide, looking fixed just above Smith's head. Cowell then seemed to notice Smith had looked up, and he quickly said, Yes, I think so. The office door behind Smith was slowly swinging shut. Sooty, who was lurking with her bristly, thick, black body pressed against it, spinners flexing, her face leering in its never-ending, endless scream. Cowell's blood ran cold, and he immediately feared for the officer's safety. Then another thought quietly entered his mind. 2 of them. 6 of us. Would you be able to give me some more contact details as soon as I have confirmed with my higher-up that I'm able to contact you immediately and tell you how we plan to proceed? Cowell seemed to refocus his eyes a second time. Yes, of course. Let me just grab my phone. Cowell reached for the desk drawer to his right and opened it. From Smith's point of view, Cowell suddenly paused and looked frozen in place before closing the drawer very slowly and whispering something to himself. From Cowell's point of view, he was startled to find Incy curled up inside the drawer. The rhythmic rising and falling of her thorax stopped, and she raised her doll-like face to murmur, "Huh?" As he slowly closed the door, Cowell's eyes lifted to just behind Smith's head, and then back to meet his eyes. I have a card. I forgot. Cowell reached across to open the drawer on his left, and as he did so, again, with almost comic carefulness, he held out he had with the office door. And there it is, Cowell said, with what seemed like undue relief as he withdrew a beige rectangle with printed details and passed it across the desk to Smith. One more thing, just quickly, if I may, Smith said, changing his tone to sound light and airy. Cowell raised his eyebrows. We checked in the history of the cab firm. Just standard procedure, you understand. It's all on public records, so no need for any authorities on that. You paid for the lease outright and for the renovations. No loans, nothing. Not many people can lay their hands on close to 100,000 like that. Cavell nodded. It's a bit of an embarrassment, to be honest. Have you heard the name Malencron? Baron Malencron? Smith mulled for a few moments. Oh, yes. There was a movie, wasn't there? Cavell nodded again, this time with a slightly rueful expression. One of my relatives going away back was kind of the author of the stories. It was made into a movie eventually. My family gets a cut from all the publishing residuals and the IP when they made the film. I also inherited a good deal from an uncle in my 20s. I wasn't doing anything with it besides buying records. It was good. The film, I mean, weird and creepy, but good. I haven't seen it, to be honest. I read the stories when I was a kid, but I've always kind of wanted not to be overshadowed, to have someone else's stories constantly busting into mine, so to speak. Cavell nodded along to his own statement. His lips pursed. Baron Malencron's narrative of his marvelous tales and a description of a time he visited Mars. Of course, such a feat is literally impossible, so I was forced to acquire the assistance of equally impossible entities, the delightful man-sized moths which fly to and from the Great Bear, presumably attracted by the light of our sun in the manner by which their smaller brethren are to our bedside candles. So, delighted with my natural eloquence and wealth of amusing anecdotes were they, that they offered to take my very brain matter from me as a source of experimentation. Now, deeply flattered though I was, I instead offered up the matter of my trusted lifelong butler Sigmund, the man who literally raised me as my father and mother both died of the plague when I was but a mewling infant. Once the can had been popped, so to speak, off we went. Sigmund, happy, smug, snug as a bug and silent in his new home, and me and my new friends marveling at the stars as they slid below our helm.